In 1977, George Lucas changed cinema forever with Star Wars. 10 years later, Mel Brooks, the man behind Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein, decided the galaxy needed a little less destiny and a lot more nonsense. The result was Spaceballs, a movie so absurd it somehow became one of the most quotable comedies of its generation. It starred Bill Pullman as the reluctant hero Lone Star, John Candy as his half-man, half-dog best friend Barf, Daphne Zuniga as the sharp-tongued Princess Vespa, and Rick Moranis as the tiny but terrifying villain Dark Helmet. Mel Brooks himself showed up twice, once as the bumbling President Scrub, and once buried in gold body paint as the wise little Guru Yogurt. When it hit theaters, Spaceballs didn't set the box office on fire. Critics were lukewarm, but somehow, this movie clawed its way into pop culture history and stayed there for almost 40 years. Today we're digging into 15 strange, surprising, and occasionally disgusting stories from behind the scenes of Spaceballs, including the real reason George Lucas allowed the parody to exist, the puppet that started rotting on set, and how a throwaway joke about a sequel actually turned into a real movie decades later. Stick around for the very last one, because the story of how this box office underachiever became a beloved classic is genuinely one of the best comebacks in Hollywood history. Let's get into it. You don't casually decide to spoof the biggest movie franchise on the planet without covering your legal bases, and Mel Brooks knew that better than anyone. Before a single frame of Spaceballs was shot, Brooks reached out directly to George Lucas to get his blessing. Surprisingly, Lucas was completely on board. He was a fan of Brooks's comedy and found the whole idea flattering rather than threatening. There was, however, one non-negotiable condition: no merchandise. Lucas had built an empire on Star Wars toys, lunchboxes, and action figures, and he wasn't interested in sharing even a small slice of that pie with a comedy that borrowed his universe's DNA. Rather than treat this as a limitation, Brooks turned it into one of the film's best-running gags. Characters in Spaceballs openly joke about Spaceballs merchandise that could never exist: the flamethrower, the coloring book, the lunchbox, poking fun at the very restriction placed on the production. It's a rare case of a legal boundary becoming a punchline instead of a problem. Anyone who's seen the opening of the original Star Wars remembers the awe of watching an enormous Star Destroyer creep across the screen for what feels like forever. Brooks looked at that iconic moment and decided the joke would land harder if he simply refused to stop. The opening shot of the villain's ship, Spaceball 1, drags on far longer than seems reasonable, well over a minute of nothing but spacecraft slowly gliding into frame. This wasn't a mistake or a pacing issue. Brooks wanted audiences to grow uncomfortable, to start wondering if the joke was actually going anywhere. The payoff, when it finally arrives, is worth the wait. A bumper sticker and a vanity license plate on the back of the ship. It's comedy built entirely on patience, daring viewers to get restless just so the eventual gag hits twice as hard. Dark Helmet is one of the most memorable comedic villains in film history, and a lot of that comes down to how much creative freedom Rick Moranis was given. While the character was written as a parody of Darth Vader, Moranis brought an entirely different energy to the role. Less menacing emperor in training, more insecure guy who's mad nobody takes him seriously. Much of what makes Dark Helmet so funny wasn't scripted in advance. Moranis leaned into physical comedy, playing with toys in his command chair and delivering lines with total deadpan sincerity, as if he genuinely believed he was intimidating. That commitment is what sells the joke. He never winks at the camera or plays it for laughs directly. He plays the role completely straight, which somehow makes the character's ridiculousness land even harder. Believe it or not, one of the most beloved characters in the film almost didn't happen the way audiences remember it. Barf was originally designed with a much heavier costume, one that would have covered most of John Candy's face. Candy, understandably, wasn't thrilled about hiding his expressive comedic delivery behind a mask, and he nearly walked away from the project entirely. The production went back to the drawing board and reworked the costume into something lighter: a small prosthetic nose, patches of fur, and mechanical ears and tail rather than a full head covering. This let Candy's natural warmth and comic timing shine through, which is a big part of why Barf feels like such a lovable, fully realized character instead of just a guy in a dog suit. Long before Bill Pullman was known for leading man roles, he was working as a stage actor picking up odd jobs to pay rent. Before he landed the role of Lone Star, Brooks reportedly considered several more established names for the part, including some big Hollywood players of the era. Ultimately, none of them fit the tone Brooks was going for. What Brooks needed wasn't a classic action hero. He needed someone who could play confusion and heroism at the same time, a guy who stumbles into being the hero almost by accident. Pullman's grounded, slightly bewildered energy made him the perfect anchor for a film filled with larger-than-life comedic performances from Candy and Moranis. Being the normal one in a cast of scene stealers turned out to be its own kind of skill. If you've seen Alien, you know exactly how disturbing the chest-bursting dinner scene is. Spaceballs takes that same horror and flips it completely on its head, and it only works because John Hurt agreed to come back and spoof his own most famous scene from 8 years earlier. Hurt reportedly thought he was signing on for a quick, simple cameo. Instead, he found himself on a set built to look almost identical to the original diner scene from Alien, right down to the table and the surrounding cast reacting in horror. Rather than back out, Hurt fully committed to the bit. What starts as an eerie recreation of real cinematic horror suddenly turns into a miniature musical number, complete with a top hat and cane. Taking one of film history's scariest moments and turning it into vaudeville is peak Mel Brooks, and it only worked because the original actor was willing to laugh at himself. Spaceballs saves one more classic sci-fi reference for its final scene, when the wreckage of the villain's giant vacuum-shaped weapon crash lands on a beach. The imagery deliberately echoes the ending of Planet of the Apes, where a half-buried statue of Liberty reveals a devastating twist. Instead of Lady Liberty, audiences get the decapitated head of a giant robotic maid, and instead of a gut-punch reveal, they get an absurd exchange between two confused characters on horseback. It's a small moment, but it shows how much Brooks loved packing his parody with references beyond just Star Wars. He wasn't only mocking one franchise, he was needling the entire genre of self-serious science fiction filmmaking. Spaceballs' answer to C-3PO is Matrix, Princess Vespa's sarcastic robotic companion, and the character was actually a combined effort between two performers working independently. A physical performer wore the elaborate golden costume on set, handling all the robotic movement, while the voice was provided separately by a well-known comedian known for her sharp, biting delivery. The costume itself was reportedly uncomfortable to wear for long periods, built from rigid materials that made it difficult for the performer to sit down or move freely between takes. That physical stiffness accidentally worked in the film's favor, giving Matrix a genuinely robotic, mechanical way of moving that couldn't have been faked as convincingly through acting alone. One of the film's most clever meta-jokes came directly from something happening in Brooks's own living room. In the mid-1980s, home video was exploding in popularity, and Brooks, like millions of other people, had just started collecting movies on VHS. That gave him an idea. What if the villains in his movie could pop in a copy of the film itself to figure out where the heroes had gone? The resulting scene, where Dark Helmet and President Scrooge fast-forward and rewind through an actual VHS copy of Spaceballs to catch up with the plot, is a joke wrapped inside a joke. It pokes fun at the very format audiences were using to watch the film at home, blurring the line between the story and the way people were consuming it. It's the kind of self-aware humor that feels ahead of its time even decades later. Never one to sit on the sidelines of his own productions, Brooks took on double duty in Spaceballs, playing both the incompetent President Scrooge and the wise little guru Yogurt, a clear parody of Yoda. Scrooge's name is simply Brooks spelled backward, a subtle joke buried in plain sight for anyone paying attention. Yogurt, on the other hand, required a much more demanding transformation. Getting into the role meant hours in gold makeup and prosthetics every single shooting day, along with kneeling on set for extended periods to appear shorter. The gold makeup reportedly caused skin irritation, forcing the production to shoot his scenes out of order so his skin could recover between sessions. It's a small but telling detail about how much physical discomfort went into one of the film's silliest characters. On paper, Princess Vespa could have easily been reduced to a stereotypical, helpless royal waiting to be rescued. Daphne Zuniga, who had built a reputation on more dramatic roles, was reportedly hesitant about signing on for exactly that reason. But Brooks had different plans for the character from the start. Instead of playing Vespa as clueless or passive, Zuniga brought a confident, quick-witted energy to the role, refusing to let the character become a punchline. She's sharp with the men around her, unimpressed by the chaos of the plot, and frequently the most competent person in any scene she's in. It's a small but meaningful choice that gave the film's central rescue mission a much more interesting dynamic than the typical damsel storyline would have allowed. Big science fiction films of the era often ended with a sweeping orchestral score, so naturally Brooks decided to do the exact opposite. Spaceballs closes with a funky, synth-driven theme song performed by a respected R&B vocal group best known for soulful hits from earlier decades. The tonal whiplash of a serious, talented group singing enthusiastically about a space parody is part of what makes the choice so memorable. The song wasn't a chart-topping hit, but it became a cult favorite among fans who discovered the film through VHS rentals and cable reruns. It's a perfect example of how Brooks liked to undercut grandeur with something completely unexpected, trading galactic orchestral swells for a track that sounds like it belongs at a roller disco. Few movie villains have had a stranger production story than Pizza the Hut, the film's gangster-like crime boss, who is, quite literally, a giant sentient pizza. The character wasn't a digital effect or a simple costume. It was a full animatronic puppet built from fiberglass, latex, and a heated compound designed to look like melting, oozing cheese. To keep that effect convincing under studio lighting, the puppet had to be kept warm, which sped up the decomposition of its organic materials. Within just a few days of filming, the puppet reportedly began to rot, filling the set with an unpleasant smell strong enough to bother the entire crew. By the time filming wrapped, the puppet had deteriorated so much that it couldn't be preserved or reused. It's a genuinely bizarre piece of movie-making history hiding behind one of the film's funniest scenes. In the original film, Yogurt breaks the fourth wall to plug fictional merchandise, casually mentioning a sequel titled Spaceballs 2, The Search for More Money. It was meant purely as a joke about Hollywood's obsession with cash-grab sequels, a punchline, nothing more. For decades, that's exactly what it remained. Brooks would occasionally reference it in interviews, half-jokingly promising a sequel someday. Given the passing of several key cast and crew members over the years, a genuine reunion seemed unlikely. But remarkably, that throwaway line has since evolved into an actual film in production, with Brooks returning in a producing role and several original cast members reportedly attached to reprise their characters alongside a new generation of actors. A joke about pointless sequels somehow became a real sequel, which feels like exactly the kind of irony Brooks would appreciate. When Spaceballs opened in theaters in 1987, it didn't come close to matching the box office numbers of the franchise it was spoofing. Reviews were mixed, with some critics finding it too silly and others feeling it leaned too hard into self-awareness. By typical Hollywood standards, it looked like it might fade into obscurity as a forgettable one-off parody. Then home video and cable television gave it a second life. As the film made its way into video rental stores and started airing repeatedly on cable, it found an entirely new audience who watched it over and over until they could recite entire scenes from memory. By the 1990s, it had become a staple among a generation that grew up quoting its best lines to each other, and its influence carried on through references in later animated comedies and even its own short-lived animated spin-off. It's a rare kind of Hollywood story, a film that didn't need to dominate opening weekend to become a classic. Instead, it earned its place slowly, one rental, one rerun, and one new fan at a time, eventually becoming beloved enough to justify a real sequel decades later. And that wraps up 15 strange, surprising stories behind one of the most quietly influential comedies of the 1980s. From a rotting puppet villain to a joke that eventually became a real movie, Spaceballs is proof that sometimes the weirdest, messiest productions are the ones that end up sticking around the longest. Which of these facts caught you off guard? Let us know down in the comments. And if you're already looking forward to seeing this cast return to the galaxy, share which character you're most excited to see again. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.